AI, does not appear as a separate line on an electric bill. There is no charge labeled data center. There is no fee labeled machine learning. The bill does not tell a household how much of the local grid may be expanded to serve artificial intelligence. Behind every AI model, cloud service, automated response, and server farm is a physical demand for electricity. Data centers require continuous power for servers, cooling systems, networking equipment, backup power, substations, transmission lines, and the power plants needed to keep the system running. When electricity demand rises quickly, the grid has to respond. Utilities may need new generation. Grid operators may need new transmission. Local networks may need new substations. Capacity markets may need to pay more to ensure enough power is available. Those costs do not necessarily remain inside the walls of a data center. Depending on the region, the regulatory rules, and how costs are allocated, some of that expense can move into the broader electric system. Once it enters that system, it can affect households, small businesses, factories, renters, homeowners, and middle-class families that depend on the same grid. This is not a story about one company. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, utilities, nuclear operators, grid regulators, and state consumer advocates all appear in it. But the economic impact on ordinary people is the central issue. The question is not whether AI uses electricity, that is already established. The question is who pays for the infrastructure AI requires. In 2024, data centers used about 415 terawatt-hours of electricity worldwide, equal to around 1.5% of global electricity consumption. By 2030, the International Energy Agency projects that global data center electricity consumption could more than double to about 945 terawatt-hours, a sector that already uses more electricity than many countries is growing quickly, and the IEA identifies AI as the most important driver of that growth. The United States is at the center of the shift. In 2024, it accounted for 45% of global data center electricity consumption. China accounted for 25%, and Europe accounted for 15%. The Department of Energy and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory estimated that U.S. data centers used 176 terawatt-hours of electricity in 2023, or about 4.4% of total U.S. electricity use. In 2014, the figure was 58 terawatt-hours. In less than a decade, U.S. data center electricity use rose sharply. The official projection is that it could reach between 325 and 580 terawatt-hours by 2028. That would put data centers at between 6.7% and 12% of total U.S. electricity consumption. That growth becomes a planning issue for the power system. It affects construction, fuel demand, capacity prices, transmission requirements, and debates over cost allocation. In some regions, it can become part of the price households pay to keep the lights on. The warning has already been stated publicly. On January 13, 2026, the U.S. Energy Information Administration forecasts that electricity demand would rise by 1% in 2026 and 3% in 2027. EIA said this would mark the first four-year run of rising power demand since 2007, and the strongest four-year growth since 2000. EIA Administrator Tristan Abbey said, "Natural gas supply is critical, as electricity demand rises through 2027, driven largely by large computing facilities, including data centers. That statement connects the AI build-out to the energy system households already depend on. Electricity is not only a technology issue, it is also a fuel issue, a grid issue, a reliability issue, and, for households, a bill issue. EIAS. May 2026 outlook said U.S. residential electricity prices would average 18.2 cents per kilowatt in 2026, a nearly 5% increase from 2025. It also expected slower growth of about 2% in 2027. Those price increases are not caused only by AI. Electricity prices are affected by fuel costs, wholesale power prices, weather, transmission spending, capacity markets, utility regulation, and regional supply conditions. But AI and data centers are now a major new source of demand layered on top of those existing pressures. The economic chain is direct. AI expands. Data centers draw more power. The grid must serve that load. Utilities and grid operators plan new infrastructure. Costs enter the electricity system. Depending on regulation, some of those costs can reach households and businesses that never requested the demand in the first place. A data center is not simply a building filled with servers. It is a long-term claim on local electricity supply. On average, around 60% of a data center's electricity use goes to servers that process and store information. Cooling is another major use. In efficient hyperscale facilities, cooling can account for about 7% of electricity use. In less efficient enterprise facilities, it can exceed 30%. AI changes the profile further. AI-optimized hyperscale data centers use advanced chips that can consume 2 to 4 times as many watts as traditional chips. The more AI expands, the more the physical economy must support a service most users experience as digital. A typical AI-focused hyperscale data center can consume as much electricity annually as 100,000 households. Larger AI-focused facilities under construction are expected to use 20 times as much. One facility can represent the power demand of a small city. When facilities cluster in the same region, the effect becomes larger than one company purchasing electricity. It becomes a regional grid issue. The IEA notes that nearly half of U.S. data center capacity is concentrated in 5 regional clusters. That concentration helps explain why the consequences are uneven. Some regions face the pressure earlier. Some utilities must respond sooner. Some customers can become part of cost allocation disputes they may never have followed. Virginia is the clearest example from the research. In 2023, data centers consumed about 26% of Virginia's total electricity supply. North Dakota was at 15%. Nebraska was at 12%. Iowa and Oregon were each at 11%. Virginia matters because Northern Virginia is one of the world's largest data center markets. The state's legislative review found that data centers' increased energy demand will likely increase system costs for all customers, including customers that are not data centers. The reason is that new generation and transmission infrastructure will be needed, and fixed costs have to be recovered. For households, the issue is whether the large customers driving the expansion pay the full cost of that expansion, or whether part of the cost is spread across the system. That difference can determine whether a corporate energy requirement remains mostly private or becomes embedded in regulated electric rates. A similar pattern appears in the PJM region. PJM interconnection operates the regional grid serving all or parts of 13 states and Washington. DC, it has become a major flashpoint because of capacity market prices, transmission planning, and cost allocation connected to data center-driven load growth. Reuters reported that PJM forecasts a 32 gigawatt increase in system demand by 2030, with 30 gigawatts attributed to data centers. Data centers expand and require more electricity. The grid operator sees a large increase in projected system demand. The region must then secure enough power and infrastructure to serve that demand, because households and small businesses are connected to the same grid. The cost of serving that demand becomes a public concern. In September 2025, Reuters reported that PJM capacity auction prices rose sharply. Prices moved from $28.92 per megawatt day for 2024 to 2025 to $269.92 per megawatt day for 2025 to 2026, and were capped at $329.17 per megawatt day for 2026 to 2027, Reuters attributed the surge primarily to data center demand, especially in Northern Virginia, along with broader load growth. Capacity markets are not usually visible to households. They exist to ensure that enough power is available when the system needs it. When capacity becomes more expensive, that cost can become part of the broader electricity cost structure. Not every bill changes for a single reason, but the economic mechanism is real. Higher projected demand can raise the cost of securing power. Higher system costs can put pressure on rates. Households experience that pressure as a utility bill that rises even when their own usage has not changed much. That is why Maryland's Office of People's Counsel filed a complaint at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in May 2026. The complaint challenged PJM rules tied to data center-driven transmission costs. The Maryland Office of People's Counsel argued that Maryland customers were being allocated costs for transmission projects, largely driven by data center growth outside Maryland. Its statement was direct. The $22 billion in new transmission investment is overwhelmingly to meet the need created by data center demand. This is one of the clearest examples of the controversy. The grid may need investment. The dispute is over who pays when that investment is triggered by concentrated demand from large new users. Data center demand rises in parts of the PJM system. Transmission investment is planned, and cost allocation becomes disputed. Customers in places with comparatively modest load growth may still be asked to pay for infrastructure tied to growth elsewhere, depending on the rules. This is the basis of the hidden AI cost argument. It is not a literal tax or a separate government charge called AI. It is a potential cost shift inside the electricity system. For a household, electricity is not optional. It powers heating, cooling, refrigeration, work, school, medical devices, cooking, internet access, and daily routines. When electricity costs rise, people cannot simply opt out in the same way they might delay a purchase or cancel a subscription. The burden is also uneven. A large technology company can negotiate long-term power contracts. It can seek nuclear power, geothermal power, or special utility arrangements. It can finance data centers, build redundancy, and plan around power markets. A middle-class household usually cannot negotiate with the grid. It receives the bill. That is why the corporate power deals matter. On September 20, 2024, Constellation Energy announced a 20-year power purchase agreement with Microsoft to support restarting 3 Mile Island Unit 1, now branded as the Crane Clean Energy Center. The electricity is intended to support Microsoft data centers in the Mid-Atlantic region. The reactor had been shut down for economic reasons 5 years before the announcement. Constellation said Unit 1 is separate from the reactor involved in the 1979 accident. Microsoft's long-term power agreement tied to a nuclear restart shows how data center demand is influencing major energy infrastructure decisions. A previously closed power asset becomes part of the response to growing electricity needs from the AI and cloud economy. The impact reaches beyond the buyer because the regional power system is shared by ordinary customers. Even that response faces grid constraints. In March 2026, Reuters reported that PJM told Constellation the former 3 Mile Island reactor may not reconnect until 2031, later than Constellation's initial 2027 plan, because of transmission infrastructure timelines. A company can sign a contract, and a plant can be planned for restart, but the grid must still be able to connect and transmit the electricity. When the grid cannot move fast enough, the system remains under pressure. Google's strategy shows another side of the same pattern. On November 28, 2023, Google announced that its Fervo-enhanced geothermal project was operational and that carbon-free electricity had started flowing onto the local grid serving Google's Nevada data centers. In June 2024, Google and N.V Energy announced a deal that would increase geothermal electricity serving Google's operations from 3.5 megawatts to 115 megawatts in about 6 years, pending regulatory approval. Google's geothermal arrangement shows how AI and cloud demand are pushing large technology companies toward more firm clean power arrangements. The energy system must adapt not only to higher electricity demand, but to demand that runs continuously, reliably, and often with cleaner power attached. Meta followed a similar direction. On December 3, 2024, Meta announced it would release a request for proposals to identify nuclear energy developers, targeting 1 to 4 gigawatts of new U.S. nuclear generation capacity to support AI innovation and sustainability objectives. Amazon and AWS also appear in the nuclear power trend. Tollin Energy's arrangement with Amazon was announced in early 2024 and was described by Reuters as a first-of-its-kind co-located power arrangement. Tollin would ramp up power supplied from its Susquehanna nuclear plant to the data center to as much as 960 megawatts over several years. A later report said, Tollin entered into a 1,920 megawatt power purchase agreement with AWS to supply data centers in Pennsylvania from the Susquehanna nuclear plant. These deals show the scale of the shift. AI companies are not simply buying electricity in the background. They are becoming major forces in power procurement. That may help bring new or existing energy resources into service. It may support cleaner energy projects. It may improve reliability for the buyer. But the public cost question remains. When large private demand requires shared grid upgrades, how much of the cost stays with the large user, and how much moves into the common system? Supporters of data center expansion argue that these facilities power AI cloud services, digital infrastructure, national competitiveness, local investment, and jobs. The Department of Energy's December 2024 framing emphasized that data center expansion reflects investment in artificial intelligence and other breakthrough technologies, while also creating greater demand on domestic energy supply. Former U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm said, "The United States has seen an incredible investment in artificial intelligence and other breakthrough technologies. She connected that investment to greater demand on our domestic energy supply. The investment is real. The technology is important. The demand is connected to services many people use every day. Consumer advocates and state-level reviews have raised a different concern. The cost structure may not be neutral. Virginia's legislative review said increased data center demand will likely increase system costs for all customers, including non-data center customers. Maryland's Office of People's Counsel argued that customers could be assigned costs for transmission projects driven largely by data center growth elsewhere. Both positions can coexist. AI infrastructure can be economically important, and ordinary customers can still face higher system costs because of it. The issue is cost movement. The cost begins inside a data center, but it may move into power procurement, grid planning, transmission debates, and capacity markets. Depending on regulation, it can move toward households. In 2014, U.S. data centers consumed 58 terawatt-hours of electricity. By 2023, they consumed 176 terawatt. By 2028, the Department of Energy and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory projected they could consume between 325 and 580 terawatt-hours. Globally, data centers used about 415 terawatt-hours in 2024. By 2030, the IEA projects that number could reach about 945 terawatt-hours. In the United States, data centers are projected by the IEA to account for nearly half of electricity demand growth between now and 2030. The pattern is no longer isolated. It involves rising demand, concentrated load, infrastructure pressure, and disputes over who pays. The household impact is not limited to the electricity bill alone. Electricity is an input into daily life and the broader economy. Small businesses use it to operate. Grocery stores use it for refrigeration. Warehouses use it for lighting and logistics. Manufacturers use it for production. Landlords and building owners use it for common systems. Families use it for routine needs. When electricity becomes more expensive or less predictable, the pressure spreads outward. That does not mean every price increase is caused by AI. It does not mean every household pays the same amount because of data centers. It also does not mean every data center project is harmful. It means AI now belongs in the discussion of cost pressure. The electric grid is shared. When a shared system has to expand for new industrial-scale demand, ordinary customers have a stake in how the costs are assigned. Most people never see that assignment process. The bill arrives in familiar categories: kilowatt-hours, delivery charges, supply charges, taxes, and fees. Behind those categories is a larger system of power plants, transmission lines, substations, capacity markets, regulatory filings, long-term power contracts, state reviews, federal complaints, forecasts, delays, and cost allocations. AI enters that system as a source of demand. It changes infrastructure planning and the economics of electricity. Once those economics change, the consequences can reach people far from the original corporate decision. As of May 2026, U.S. power demand is still forecast to rise through 2027. EIA expects electricity use to grow in 2026 and 2027, with large computing facilities, including data centers, cited as a major driver. Residential electricity prices are also forecast to rise. EIA expects the average U.S. residential electricity price to reach 18.2 cents per kilowatt-hour in 2026, nearly 5% higher than in 2025, with slower growth in 2027. The PJM region remains a flashpoint. Capacity prices have risen sharply. Data center demand, especially in Northern Virginia, has been identified as a major driver. Maryland's Office of People's Counsel is challenging cost allocation tied to data center-driven transmission investments. The nuclear data center trend is active, but not guaranteed. Microsoft's 3 Mile Island-linked deal depends on regulatory and grid connection progress. PJM has indicated the plant may not reconnect until 2031 because of transmission infrastructure timelines. Big tech is increasingly seeking firm power. Microsoft is tied to nuclear. Google is tied to geothermal. Meta is seeking nuclear capacity. Amazon and AWS are tied to nuclear-backed power arrangements. The unresolved pressure is clear. AI needs electricity. Electricity needs infrastructure. Infrastructure requires money. The dispute is over where that money comes from. For households, the evidence does not show that AI will instantly double every electric bill. The warning is narrower and more grounded. An electric bill may never say AI. But if data centers force the grid to expand, if capacity becomes more expensive, if transmission costs are spread across customers, and if regulators allow those costs into rates, then AI can still appear in the price ordinary people pay for power. Not as a separate fee, but as pressure inside the system. For middle-class families already paying for gas, groceries, housing, insurance, and utilities, that pressure matters. The digital economy still runs on physical infrastructure. When that infrastructure becomes more expensive, someone pays.